Every single person walking around China today. Every person who ever lived there, going back as far as we can dig, trace, and test.
Let's go back, way back, before China was called China, before there were rice fields or rivers with names, before anyone had a word for east or west. Thousands of years ago, small groups of people started walking out of Africa. Not in a rush, not all at once, slow, generation by generation, following herds, following rivers, following the weather. They didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to eat, stay warm, and keep their children alive. Some of those groups turned north, some turned east, and over time, thousands of years of time, some of them kept walking until they reached the land we now call East Asia. That long walk, that's the real beginning of the Chinese story. Not a myth, not a legend carved into a temple wall, an actual physical journey made on foot by real people whose names we will never know. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because when scientists dig up the old bones in China, the ones that are tens of thousands of years old, what they find lines up with this story, not with guesswork, with teeth, with skulls, with DNA pulled straight out of ancient remains. There's a cave in southern China called Tianyuan. Inside that cave, researchers found the remains of a person who lived around 40,000 years ago. When they tested the DNA, it matched the same deep African root that every other human population on Earth shares. That person's ancestors didn't spring up out of the ground in Asia. They walked there, from Africa, step by step, over thousands of years, through mountains and grasslands and river valleys that had never seen a human footprint before. This is not a fringe theory whispered in secret. This is what the fossil record says. This is what the genetic testing says. This is real, hard science, the kind that gets checked and rechecked by labs all over the world, keeps confirming over and over again. So let's slow down and really sit with what that means. Long before anyone in China ever thought about building a wall or writing characters or shaping bronze into tools, their ancestors were African people. Dark-skinned, thick-haired, built for the heat of the African sun. That is the starting point, not a side note, the actual starting point. Now, here's something people don't always think about. Skin color, the shape of a person's eyes, the texture of their hair, none of that happened overnight. It took thousands and thousands of years. As those early African travelers spread out across the earth, their bodies slowly changed to match the places they settled in. Picture it. A family group leaves the warm plains of Africa. They walk for generations through the Middle East, up into Central Asia, across cold mountain passes, into places where the sun barely touches the skin for half the year. Less sun means the body doesn't need as much protection from it. So slowly, over dozens of generations, skin tones shift. Eyes adjust to handle glare off snow and ice. Bodies change shape to hold on to heat better. None of this happened to one person. It happened across thousands of years, spread out over entire family lines, so slow that no single person alive at any point would have even noticed it happening. That's the real reason people look different across the world today. Not because different groups of humans started out separately, because one group of humans left Africa and spread out, and the environment slowly reshaped their bodies over an enormous stretch of time. So when you look at someone from China today, and someone from Nigeria today, and someone from Sweden today, you are looking at three branches of the exact same tree. The roots of that tree are African. Every branch, no matter how different it looks today, grew out of that same root system. Now, let's go deeper into the story of the people who became Chinese, because this part deserves real attention, not just a mention in passing. After those early travelers crossed into East Asia, they didn't just settle in one spot and stop. They spread out across a huge stretch of land, from the river valleys in the south all the way up toward the colder regions in the north. Different groups adapted to different environments. Some stayed near rivers and lived off fish and wild plants. Some moved into forests and hunted. Some pushed further north into colder land and had to figure out how to survive freezing winters with nothing but stone tools, fire, and animal skins. This is where you start to see the foundations of what would eventually become Chinese civilization. Not kings, not emperors, not palaces, just small groups of people, descendants of those original African travelers, learning how to survive in a brand new part of the world. Around the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, something important started happening. People began to notice that certain wild plants, if you saved the seeds and planted them again the next season, would grow back the next season. This wasn't taught in a school. Nobody wrote it down in a book. It was learned by watching, by trial and error, by paying close attention to the land over many, many years. This is the beginning of farming in that part of the world, and it's a massive turning point. Because once people can grow food instead of only hunting and gathering it, they can stay in one place. They can build permanent homes. They can raise bigger families. They can start forming actual communities instead of small traveling groups. Millet was one of the first crops grown in the north. Rice became huge in the south, especially around the Yangtze River area, where the wet, warm climate was perfect for it. These weren't small experiments. Archaeologists have found rice remains in that region that are thousands of years old, proof that these communities had figured out real farming systems long before the most of the world caught up. And all of this, every bit of it, traces back to those original people whose ancestors walked out of Africa. This is their story continuing, not stopping, not restarting somewhere else, continuing. As farming spread, villages grew bigger. Bigger villages meant more people living close together, which meant they needed ways to organize themselves. Who plants what? Who stores the grain? Who protects the village if trouble comes? Slowly, these small farming communities started developing early forms of leadership, early forms of trade, early forms of shared belief systems.
Pottery started showing up around this time too. Not fancy decoration for its own sake, practical pottery, made to store grain, carry water, cook food. But if you look closely at some of the oldest pottery found in this region, you can already see patterns being carved and painted into it. People were not just surviving, they were starting to express themselves. That's a huge moment in any culture's story, the point where survival turns into identity. Now let's talk about something people rarely bring up when discussing ancient China, and that's the deep, direct link between these early river valley communities and the wider human story that started in Africa. Genetic studies done on ancient remains from these early Chinese farming communities show clear connections back through that same long migration route out of Africa. This isn't a stretch. This isn't wishful thinking. This is documented in peer-reviewed research, tested through actual DNA extraction from bones that are thousands of years old. What this tells us is powerful. The people who built these early farming villages along the Yellow River and the Yangtze River were direct descendants of that original African migration. Their ancestors made that walk. Their ancestors adapted to that environment. Their ancestors are the reason an entire civilization eventually rose up in that part of the world. Let's keep moving forward in time, because the story doesn't stop at farming villages. As these communities grew, they started interacting with each other more, trading goods, sharing knowledge, sometimes competing over land and resources. Out of all of this, larger and larger settlements began to form. Some of these settlements grew into what archaeologists call early cultures, given names based on where their remains were first discovered. The Yangshao culture, the Longshan culture. These aren't random labels. They represent real communities of real people who lived, farmed, built homes, raised families, and slowly built the foundation for what would eventually become one of the largest and longest-lasting civilizations in human history.
Longshan culture is especially interesting because this is where you start to see more advanced pottery, early forms of walled settlements, and evidence of organized labor. People were working together on bigger projects, building walls around villages for protection, digging wells, creating drainage systems. This takes planning. This takes leadership. This takes a community that trusts each other enough to work towards something bigger than any one person. All of this, again, traces directly back to that original migration out of Africa. Every tool, every wall, every well, every planted field of rice or millet, it's all part of one continuous human story that started with people walking away from the African continent thousands and thousands of years ago. Now here's something worth sitting with for a moment. When we talk about ancient civilizations, people often treat them like they popped up out of nowhere, completely separate from everything else happening on Earth. Like China's story and Africa's story are two totally different books sitting on two totally different shelves. But that's not accurate. It's actually one long story with many chapters, and Africa is where the very first chapter was written. Every group of people on every continent is living out a later chapter of that same original story. The people who eventually became Chinese are not an exception to this. They are a clear, well-documented example of it. Their ancestors made an incredible journey, adapted to a brand new environment over thousands of years, and built something lasting out of it. Let's talk a little more about what that early journey actually looked like, because it deserves real respect. Imagine walking for your entire life, and then your children walking for their entire life, and then their children after that, slowly moving across unfamiliar land with no maps, no compasses, no way of knowing what was ahead. Crossing mountain ranges, crossing rivers with no bridges, facing extreme cold for the first time after generations of living in warm climates, learning how to hunt new animals, learning how to find food in forests and grasslands that looked nothing like the land their ancestors came from. This wasn't a straight line either. Groups split off, some settled early, some kept pushing further, some doubled back. Over thousands of years, this slow, spreading movement covered incredible distances, eventually reaching all the way into what we now call East Asia. Every single person who made it, who survived long enough to have children, who passed down knowledge about which plants were safe to eat and which animals were dangerous, they are the reason there is a Chinese population on Earth today. Not myth, not legend. Real people doing real work, surviving real hardship, generation after generation. And when their descendants finally settled along those river valleys, when they started farming, when they built villages, they were carrying something that connected all the way back to Africa. Not just their appearance, which slowly changed to fit their new environment, their resilience, their ability to adapt, their determination to keep going even when conditions were brutal. That's the real inheritance here, not just genetics, a spirit of survival that got passed down from the very first people who left Africa all the way through thousands of years, all the way to the farmers who planted the first rice fields along the Yangtze River. Let's talk a little more about something else that connects back to this deep African root, and that's how these early communities in China started developing early belief systems and ways of understanding the world around them. Long before formal religion as we think of it today, early communities everywhere, including these early Chinese farming villages, developed ways of explaining things they couldn't fully understand. Why the sun rises, why the seasons change, why crops sometimes fail. Archaeologists have found evidence of ritual burials in these early Chinese sites, meaning people were already thinking carefully about death, about what happens after, about honoring the people who came before them.
This kind of thinking, this need to understand life and death and the world around us, that's not something that started in China. It's something that started way back with early humans in Africa, and it traveled with every migrating group, getting shaped and reshaped by each new environment they settled in.
So even the earliest spiritual thinking in ancient China carries traces of that same deep African root, passed down and transformed over thousands of years. Now, by the time we get further along in this story, these river valley communities in China had grown into something much bigger. Villages turned into towns, towns turned into larger settlements with more organized systems of leadership. Trade networks stretched out further, connecting communities that had never had contact before. Tools improved, farming techniques improved, populations grew steadily. All of this happened over an enormous stretch of time, thousands of years of slow, steady human effort, no shortcuts, no sudden jumps, just generation after generation building on what came before, improving it, passing it down, and building on it again. And through every single one of those generations, the thread connecting back to that original African migration never broke. It's there in the DNA of ancient skeletons pulled from riverbanks. It's there in the slow physical changes that happened over thousands of years as bodies adapted to a new environment. It's there in the basic human drive to survive, to build community, to pass knowledge down to the next generation, a drive that started with the very first humans in Africa and never stopped moving forward. This is the real story, not a story that needs exaggeration to be powerful, not a story that needs shortcuts to be meaningful. The real, documented story of how one of the largest civilizations in human history has its roots, its actual roots, sitting firmly in Africa. Every time you hear about ancient Chinese history, about the rise of farming along the Yellow River, about the early cultures that eventually grew into a massive civilization, remember what's underneath all of that. Remember the thousands of years of walking. Remember the slow adaptation to freezing winters and unfamiliar land. Remember that every person involved in that story is a direct descendant of people who once called Africa home. That's not a small detail tucked away in some corner of history. That is the foundation the entire story is built on. So the next time someone tells you that human history is made up of a bunch of separate stories happening in different parts of the world with no connection to each other, you'll know better. You'll know that every one of those stories, no matter where it eventually unfolds, no matter how different the people involved eventually come to look, starts from the exact same place, Africa. And the people who became Chinese, the ones who farmed the Yellow River, who built the early walled villages, who figured out how to survive brutal winters and dense forests, they carried that African root with them the entire way. Thousands of years of it, passed down generation after generation, all the way to today. If this kind of real, deep history means something to you, if you want more stories like this, told straight, told true without any shortcuts, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this story left to tell, and I want you here for the next part of it.